What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing close encounters of the sixth kind, deadly encounters with UFOs and ETs. We've discussed more alien encounters and encounters with UFOs on this channel than I could count, and it amazes me sometimes that there are even any left to talk about. It baffles me how there can still be people out there saying that these types of encounters don't happen or that extraterrestrials don't exist. With all of the encounters and interactions just that we've gone over, covering at least 1,000 different types of entities within those encounters, the fact that there are still so many more and even more that I come across every single day from all over the world and across so many different cultures, that's what says it all for me about whether or not this is all really happening. Are there some people who go out of their way and make this kind of stuff up for attention, money, clout, just to lie? Sure. But I believe the biggest liars are the governments and powers that be who constantly and consistently tell us that there's no real evidence that aliens exist or that people have actually ever encountered them. I've briefly gone over all of the different kinds of close encounters and how they're classified in some of my other videos, but I want to try to do it briefly here once again for any of you who still don't know or who might have forgotten. Close encounters of the first kind refer to sightings where a UFO comes close enough to a witness, typically within about 500 feet, so that the structural details of the craft can be observed. There's no interaction by the craft with the witness or the environment in these encounters. The second kind refer to sightings that are accompanied by physical effects on the environment, witnesses or other living beings or mechanical systems, like when your car suddenly stalls. These effects include but aren't limited to burns on the ground, broken branches, electrical interference, physiological effects like paralysis or heat, and physical or chemical traces on the earth, like scorched vegetation. Of course, those are all in the context of there having been a craft that landed in a spot or area, not just that it's there in general. Close encounters of the third kind refers to human observations of animate beings or extraterrestrials. So human beings can actually see the ETs or the aliens. There's no interaction. Fourth kind refers to interaction with the non-human entities. These interactions often but not always involve medical examinations, telepathic communication, missing time, and profound psychological and or physical after effects. Close encounters of the fourth kind are what are often referred to as alien abductions, which usually involve the victims or witnesses being taken aboard the UFO or at least away from where they originally were during the initial moment of the interaction. There's an infinite number of strange scenarios, many of which we've gone over in videos about it here on this channel, and I'm sure there's an infinite number of things that have happened that we haven't even heard of yet. Close encounters of the fifth kind are usually the ones where the human beings initiate the contact with the extraterrestrial, and many people use something akin to like a CE5 app to do this. But there are many different ways that you could achieve this. However, it isn't always the human being doing the initiating, and sometimes it's bilateral or mutual. In the official definition of what this is, it says that the contact can either be initiated by the human or by the alien. But I'm not really sure I subscribe to that part of the definition, because if the alien or extraterrestrial is initiating the contact, then it would be, at least in my opinion, more akin to the fourth kind, normally but not always resulting in an abduction. Now let's move on to close encounters of the sixth kind, which is what we are specifically here to discuss today, which is when there's a close encounter of the first through fifth kind, though usually it's the first, but the human being suffers a serious injury or the contact otherwise results in the human being's death. There's also close encounters of the seventh kind, where a human and extraterrestrial mate to produce a hybrid species, though again, in my opinion, that can also be the fourth kind, with the hybrid being created as a result of the abduction and close encounters of the eighth kind, which I have yet to see a credible case, but do believe it exists, because otherwise why would it be on the scale if it didn't? The eighth kind are always hard to find information on, but it's when a human being is fully transformed somehow into the extraterrestrial they're having the contact with, and depending on where you look on the internet, provided there's actually information on it, because most encounter scales end at 5 and some end at 7, but almost no one is talking about the 8th, that explanation will change because not a lot of people know about it. I get most of my information directly from source, but as always, you're welcome to take this information and believe it or not, and to do whatever you want with it. I'm just here as a messenger, And we're here today to talk about close encounters of the sixth kind anyway, so what the eighth is and whether or not it even exists is irrelevant for our purposes here today. It's important to note here before we get started that these types of encounters where the human being or beings involved are seriously injured or killed due to their interactions with extraterrestrials in question are few and far between, and they're not reported as having happened very often. Doesn't mean they haven't happened very often, but they're not reported as having happened very often. This has already been an extremely long introduction, so one more thing before we get started is that I really would like to thank those of you who are patrons and members of my channel who contribute in any way, shape, or form financially, because without you all, I wouldn't be able to do what I love for a living. And for those of you who simply can't or don't want to donate money to the channel, but who show up every single week for the live streams and to watch these pre-recorded videos, whether in the premiere or otherwise, watching the whole thing through until the end, sharing, liking, leaving at least 7 characters in the comments underneath, you are all absolutely amazing. And I just want to thank each and every one of you from the bottom of my heart. With that being said, let's jump right in. So let's start with one of the many cases of United States Air Force pilots who many in this community believe lost their lives or went missing completely and without explanation as a direct result with interactions with or pursuit of UFOs. One of the most fascinating, in my opinion, is the February 1954 Grouse Mountain incident, but there are so many more I wish I can cover here on this channel, or at least today. This video ended up being so incredibly long, or so much longer than I initially wanted it or expected it to be, and I didn't even cover everything I meant to that I had in my research. It just goes on and on, but the cases are so fascinating, I doubt any of y'all will want to turn this off, trust me. I ended up choosing this one because the official determination of this particular incident directly goes against the actual evidence of what we know to have happened. The official determination is that this was a tragic accident due to pilot error. Due to what's since been uncovered, particularly and largely by UFO investigators, I'm frankly shocked that the determination hasn't officially been changed to at least say something unknown or unclear happened, but also that most people don't know and have ever heard about the Grouse Mountain incident also kind of baffles me. So let's talk about it. On February 12, 1954, at approximately 10:30 in the morning, Second Lieutenant Lamar Barlow was piloting his F-86 Sabre jet over Grouse Mountain in British Columbia, Canada. Lamar had departed from McChord Air Force Base, which is located across the border in Tacoma, Washington, and the purpose of him being out that morning was nothing more than a standard instrument checking exercise. It's important to note here first that the jet was fully armed, but for this seemingly benign testing mission there should have been no reason that they would have had to use any of the weapons on board or anything like that. At first, the flight was normal, it was uneventful, but it didn't take long for things to turn very bizarre. A little after noon, the control tower at McChord began to receive a mayday signal from Lamar's jet, and he was informing them that the plane's compass was no longer working, and because of that fact, he was actually lost. According to the official records in this case, at exactly 12:06 p.m., so an hour and 36 minutes after he had initially taken off for this very benign and incredibly routine, allegedly, mission, it was determined that he was flying somewhere close to 60 miles north of Vancouver, Canada. 9 minutes later, that distance dropped significantly and he was only 15 miles north of the city, so he was making great progress at finding his way back, probably with help from the control center. However, he was quickly losing fuel by that time, and preparations were made for him to make an emergency landing at Sea Island Airport in Vancouver. Before he could land, though, the communications with him completely ceased, and no one knew where he was, when he would be landing, or what he was doing. Would he be landing at all? Lieutenant Barlow and his plane were eventually recovered on a mountainside at 2,700 feet altitude. The estimation was made that this plane had slammed headfirst into the side of the mountain while traveling at a speed of approximately 750 miles per hour. His body was found still strapped and buckled into his pilot seat, and the debris from the jet was scattered literally all over the place in every direction. Immediately, there were national and international newspapers covering the tragic accident, and within a few days, the United States Air Force had made their official determination of what caused the crash public. They claimed he had seen, quote, radar ghosts, end quote, and because of this loss of his navigational equipment, he had become increasingly confused and disoriented. They said he had been much closer to Tacoma than they'd initially thought that he was, and that by the time Grouse Mountain came into his view, he had no time to react and simply crashed into the mountainside. He was killed instantly. That sounds about right and makes perfect sense to someone who doesn't know any better. And it seems that in this case, like most of the ones we talk about here on this channel, the Air Force was betting on no one knowing any better or taking any deeper look into what really happened here and kind of just taking their word for it. However, some things didn't make sense to a lot of people, particularly why Lamar would have been going so fast while descending. The military dismissed these concerns and said it was nothing more than a lack of experience on Barlow's part. But for some UFO investigators looking into the case, there were other things that didn't make sense about this case as well. For example, why was the jet carrying 24 armed rockets simply to carry out a standard navigational exercise? The military counter-argued that this was simply to mimic or reproduce the exact weight of the plane if it would actually be heading into combat. But the UFO investigators knew that this could have been done much easier without actually having the fully armed rockets on the craft at that time, because that's extremely dangerous. The smallest thing goes wrong and you're cooked, literally. Also, they thought sending such an inexperienced pilot up in the air with an armed plane as part of a standard exercise simply wasn't plausible and was questionable, to say the least. Ultimately, just as they'd suspected previously with several cases throughout the years that they'd looked into, the UFO investigators asked whether Lamar Barlow had really left Tacoma Air Force Base to carry out a training exercise, or if he'd really been sent up to investigate and intercept some sort of anomalous object, with the so-called anomalous object being some sort of UFO. These suspicions grew even more with the fact that the entire area around the crash site was sealed off and protected with armed guards for several days following this incident. The official explanation for that was that it was done in order to ensure the scene wasn't contaminated and to make sure that every last bit and piece of the wreckage was recovered, specifically the rockets themselves. However, it's unknown whether or not any of the rockets were ever fired or if they were actually recovered. Reports of an alleged cleanup operation stated that most of the rockets were recovered, not all of them. Obviously, there were a lot of people at that point who refused to accept the official explanation for Lamar's death and for the crash itself. There was just too much about it that didn't make any sense. Because of those doubts, the question as to what he was really doing up there and whether or not he had been trying to intercept a UFO, and many of the investigators involved wondered if he was instructed to use deadly force and whatever else it would take to get the anomalous object or objects out of the sky. Had it been that potential use of deadly force which caused his death? There was a lot more at play here too that came into question and didn't make much sense given the official military explanation for the tragic crash. For example, there were strange radar echoes heard that day that had never been explained, and there's also been no explanation, official or otherwise, as to what had caused his navigational equipment to fail in the first place. In light of those remaining questions, it's interesting to note here that many pilots who have encountered UFOs while in the air, including military, private, and commercial, have often reported having problems with their navigations and communications equipment, saying it was almost as though they'd been intentionally jammed, blocked, or something like that. Another interesting fact here is that at the time of the Grouse Mountain incident, the military often used the term, quote, phantom radar echoes, end quote, or ghost echoes, as the overall explanation for any and all sorts of aerial anomalies. A UFO researcher named Gord Heath came to his own potential explanation as to what happened to Lamar Barlow that morning at Grouse Mountain, and also about what had caused his navigation and communication equipment to fail in the first place. He said it was highly strange and unusual that a pilot would have been allowed to stray so far off course in the first place, and that it was standard practice for the control tower to alert the pilot in those circumstances. Why should it have been any different in this case for Barlow? Particularly when you think about the fact that Barlow had crossed the border into another country he had strayed so far away, because he wasn't initially supposed to be in Canada. Remember that according to the official report, the first time the control tower was aware that there even was a problem was when Lamar began issuing mayday calls following the loss of his navigation equipment, which means they all saw where he was going and that he was allegedly straying into another country so far off course. Why didn't they say anything? Think about this, though. If he were out there on an interception mission, like many people believe he was, then the control tower would have had no reason to worry or wonder about why he had gone so far off course, because they would have known what he was doing up there. He was following around an anomaly, a UFO. Gord Heath had to say about this in all of his own drawn conclusions, quote, which makes more sense. The radar operators ignored the jet flying off into Canadian airspace until the pilot suddenly realized he only had 30 minutes of fuel and has no clue about his position, Or the radar operators guided this pilot in pursuit of a UFO into Canadian airspace beyond the farthest distance to return to base, thinking the pilot will be able to safely land in Vancouver, end quote. Many other UFO researchers and enthusiasts agreed with Heath's statement, but there was a witness who eventually came forward and provided information that you would think would only have to come from a major Hollywood blockbuster movie. Like, it couldn't happen in real life. A twist of epic, perhaps Shyamalan, because you know about his movies, right? I don't know how to pronounce his name. Proportions. This witness was a 6-year-old girl who was returning to school after going home for her lunch break at the time, and her name was Robin McPherson. Robin told newspaper reporters that she watched as a jet plane had narrowly just missed a ski lift when she first noticed it. She said the plane was, quote, awful low, end quote, and, quote, came out of the clouds traveling very fast, end quote. She would go on to tell reporters, quote, then it sort of zoomed up and went into the trees on the side of the mountain. I didn't hear any noises like a bang, end quote. To add to all of the confusion and intrigue in this case, in that same newspaper article, a military spokesperson who most people didn't think had gotten permission to do so questioned why Barlow had not bailed out of the plane when he saw that it was about to crash into the side of a mountain. This official stated it was standard practice to do so and said that Lamar was, quote, flying as blind as a bat, end quote. However, despite all of this new evidence and all of those new and interesting statements, the military seemed determined to make sure that no one blamed anyone except Barlow and Barlow only for the crash that day. Of course, there's been no evidence put forth that proves there ever was a UFO in the skies that day or that Barlow had been sent up to intercept it at all. The rumors still persist to this day, though, and honestly, this is far from the only time the death of a military pilot happened under such bizarre and seemingly inexplicable, questionable circumstances. In fact, just months before the Grouse Mountain incident happened, a similar incident unfolded, and it once again happened along the American-Canadian border. It was several hundred miles to the east in the Sioux Locks area of Lake Superior in Michigan. On November 23, 1953, the personnel working at Sault Ste. Marie started seeing strange radar readings over their airspace, which, by the way, is strictly restricted airspace. A few moments after they first started seeing these strange readings, they detected an anomalous aerial object. Not too long after that, while they tried figuring out what was going on, Lieutenant Felix Moncla and Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson sprinted to their F-89C Scorpion fighter jet and took off in it from Kinross Air Force Base to investigate and possibly try to intercept this unknown craft. However, and though it's unknown, I feel like it's pretty safe to say it was because of the unknown craft, the jet's radar suddenly appeared to be faulty. This caused Lieutenant Moncla to have to depend on the information relayed to him and Second Lieutenant Wilson from the control tower at Kinross. In an article on this incident, Nick Redfern, whom I love so much and is a veteran UFO researcher, if you didn't know, said, quote, available USAF records demonstrate that the F-89 was vectored west-northwest, then west, climbing to 30,000 feet. While on its westerly course, the crew received permission to descend to 7,000 feet, turning east-northeast and coming steeply down on the target from above, end quote. Lieutenant Moncla started to descend, and at that time he was traveling 500 miles per hour. Suddenly, and without warning, the anomalous object quickly changed its course, and in response, Moncla did likewise. This was the start of a cat-and-mouse-like chase that continued through the skies for around a half hour before it finally seemed like the jet was closing in on whatever it was that it had been chasing. While all of this was happening, the radar operators in the control center at Kinross watched the events unfolding on their own radar screens right in front of them. They watched as the jet closed in on whatever this mysterious aerial blip was. Eventually, as they watched on in shock and confusion, the two little blips on the radar screen, meaning the jet and then the other unknown object, seemingly became one object, and those in the room watching the radar screen started prepping for communications with the fighter jet regarding how to engage and what they should do next, because it seemed like they were in the exact same space somehow or right on top of one another. They were merged. However, it seemed like the mystery object suddenly vanished from the radar screen. The F-89 vanished right along with it. So not only did the UFO disappear, but an entire military fighter jet went along with it. Attempts to communicate with the pilot immediately began, but there was no response incoming from it back to them. More jets were deployed to go and investigate what happened and where the F-89 had ended up. And obviously, they wanted to know where the pilots were and that they were okay as well. However, there were no sign of the two pilots or the plane at all, and it seemed to everyone involved as though they had all simply vanished into thin air after combining into one blip on the radar with the other. The search continued all throughout the night and well into the following day, but nothing was ever found. As you might imagine, due to the highly strange nature of the situation, and also because the United States was enduring several waves of seemingly random UFO sightings at the time, it didn't take long for the public to take a special interest in this case, as well as several UFO researchers and investigators. Probably due to all of the attention and special interest by these investigators and the wider public, the military started issuing statements about it. But the statements were conflicting between one another, and nothing seemed to make much sense as far as what their explanations were at all. The original version of events, as per the military, was released in a statement to the Associated Press, and they said that the jet and the anomalous object had merged on the radar screen, which is what I initially reported to you guys. However, once interest grew and people started questioning exactly what that meant, what it would have looked like, etc., they backed away from that statement and said no merging of any kind had ever taken place. At another point in time, a military spokesperson offered an entirely different explanation as to what happened that day and said that the mystery aerial object had simply been a Canadian fighter jet which had strayed off course and wandered into American airspace. However, the Canadian military outright rejected this explanation, and so the United States Air Force once again changed their official stance as to what really happened. This time they said that, quote, the pilot probably suffered from vertigo and crashed into the lake, end quote. What? So now they're blaming the pilot, whom they know won't ever be able to tell the story of what really happened or defend himself. And honestly, that's just such a bad look in my opinion, because this was a decorated pilot who served his country in the Air Force and had to have been so brave to have, without question, gone up into the sky in order to investigate and intercept something unknown flying around. Not to mention, this was all amidst a slew of otherwise unsolved UFO sightings at the time, and now they're just blaming him for everything because they don't want to tell the truth. No one's buying any of their ridiculous stories. Gross. So Gord Heath also offered his opinion on this incident, and one of the first things he said was how highly unlikely it was that the United States Air Force, or really any Air Force at all, would have allowed someone who suffered from vertigo pilot a fighter jet. And he also stated that he thought it was highly unlikely that Moncla had vertigo at all because of the low probability that he would have ever been able to have hidden that from the military for all of those years. Perhaps even more interesting is the fact that Gord Heath said that he had spoken to a fellow UFO researcher, a man named John Tenney, and that Tenney told him that he had a source close to him, one that gave him information, who worked in the Air Force, and that person had said that Moncla's somewhat infamous quote-unquote Cajun drawl had been heard over the communications radio by the source and others hours after the jet itself had disappeared. So Gord Heath's friend has this person who works not only in the Air Force, but was there that day watching everything go down on the radar screens. And this person said, no, hours later after the UFO and the fighter jet merged, and then they both disappeared and there was no communication, they knew it was Moncla because he had a very distinct Cajun accent. So this could possibly mean that the jet had simply vanished, but hadn't actually crashed after all. At the very least, if his voice was heard all that time later, then it would mean that the jet hadn't crashed, and at least Lieutenant Moncla was alive and still piloting the jet hours later, much later than previously had been determined. Also, I wonder if this is true, and if it is, then where were those two pilots? Where had the jet been at that time when his Cajun drawl was heard? Could they have been abducted or taken by the unusual craft or beings within it? Well, if you're a believer in the things I discussed here on this channel, then you know the answer to that one is a resounding yes. Absolutely, they could have both been abducted, and somehow the base was communicating with the UFO or something like that. Because think about it, in my opinion, it's more than likely that Moncla was still in communication with the control center while they were possibly in the midst of being abducted. Guaranteed, if this is true, and to be clear, I'm just building on the speculation of other researchers in this case and don't know that it is, but if it is true, then everyone listening more than likely knows exactly what happened that day because they would have heard it on the communications system. UFO investigators also put forth the question as to whether or not the communications said to have been coming from Moncla hours after the jets disappeared had been coming from somewhere in outer space or from a different realm or dimension and had not necessarily been coming from here on Earth. I was thinking about it, and even though I looked as best I possibly could into this, there's no word on what Moncla had actually been saying in the later communications. The last thing I wondered, and once again I'm not alone, was whether or not these later communications had been heard by only a very select few people in the control tower at the time, or whether or not it had all been broadcast to a much wider, albeit strictly military audience. And if the latter is the case, then that means that the military would have had to have been successful in silencing every single person who was present that night. I think it's more than likely that there were only a few people to be silenced that night and going forward, because it's likely someone would have eventually come forward with this information by now, and they would have been saying what exactly was being said during that point in time. Whatever the truth is, it didn't take long for the general public to start talking about a cover-up being conducted regarding and all around this case. Gord Heath once again chimed in with his opinion about why such rumors would be so prevalent, and he said there were also several reasons he believed himself that the military was at the very least suppressing information about this case. For one, he highlighted the fact that a memorial was never held for either of the two pilots, even though they were missing and officially presumed dead. The reason this is so sus is because memorials are and always were, including at the time all of this was happening, held for every single member of the military who loses their life during active duty service to their country. Remember, the official stance of the military is that these pilots had died while on active military duty and while carrying out a military mission. Also, neither of the men's wives ever received the American flag that's customarily given from the Air Force to the wives and or families of the deceased. Something's happening with my lights, so if I keep going dark and light, I do apologize. In 2003, Gord Heath told UFO BC Quarterly magazine, quote, "Was it because they, meaning the Air Force, had reason to suspect that the two crewmen might still be alive?" End quote. Many people believe Gord Heath could have been so close to the truth with that presumption, and that despite the official declarations of their deaths, it's very possible they're still alive out there somewhere, whether here on this planet or in this dimension or otherwise, and that the military more than likely knows exactly all about it and exactly where they are, mainly because they'd heard those later communications from Moncla that night after the jet seemingly disappeared into thin air. This case was far from over, though. A decade and a half after the initial incident in 1968, the case took an interesting turn when the wreckage of a fighter jet was found on the banks of Lake Michigan. The press immediately started to speculate about this wreckage, that it was actually the fighter jet from the Mark Lowe incident. However, neither the Canadian nor the American authorities ever issued any statements of any kind about the discovery of this wrecked jet. They literally never commented on it at all to say one way or another whether or not this was finally the remains of the F-89 fighter jet that disappeared all those years earlier. Was it the plane? Were the pilots in it? And if not, then what happened to them? And also, how did this wreckage, which was very visible to anyone flying by or who was otherwise near where it was found, remained hidden for 15 years? One other thing I got to thinking about was, what about if it wasn't the same jet from the incident? Why wouldn't the military comment on it, and why hadn't there been any reports of other planes of any type going down or disappearing in that area since the F-89? Meaning, this almost had to have been that plane. So why wouldn't the authorities and the military say anything at all about it, despite knowing how invested the general public had been in this particular case? It's so strange and highly sus, in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, it is alleged, and there's actually no proof or evidence that the United States or Canadian governments or authorities ever covered anything up, or even that they're withholding any real information about what happened. However, there are more than enough discrepancies in the official story that would allow room for speculation to continue even all these years later as we sit here now and talk about it in the year 2025. Here's the thing. If it was the jet, they probably would have wanted to lay the abduction theories to rest and say, yes, it's the jet. But then they would have had to explain where it's been all this time for 15 years at that point. Why no one had seen it, why it had never shown up on anyone's radar or whatever ever before. And if it's not the jet, then how come there were no other jets that had gone missing in that area for like decades up until then? Like, they should have said something, but they had no way of explaining it. Because what more than likely, in my opinion, happened is that they had sent more than one jet up at one time in 1954 to intercept UFOs. And more than one went down. This one just happened to go public. And I think after what happened with the Moncla incident with F-89, they were not going to talk about when they were sending people up anymore, and they were just going to lie and make excuses. I don't think this was that jet. I think it was another one that they sent up and didn't want to kind of get behind as being one of theirs. Too many questions. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Just to be clear, too, it's not only UFO researchers who continue to question the official narrative of what happened on November 23rd, 1953, either. Many members of the two men's families also have their own questions and concerns about what became of their loved ones. Monkla's cousin, a man named Buddy Monkla, said that he very much believed that both his cousin and Second Lieutenant Wilson were, quote, snatched by a UFO, end quote. According to Buddy's own research into these events, the last transmission from his cousin on the day in question had him stating that he was, quote, going in for a closer look, end quote. Then, immediately after, the airwaves went silent. He believes that both pilots more than likely witnessed something in the skies over Michigan that night, and that they had gone to investigate whatever it was, as they were supposed to, because that's what they were initially sent to do in the first place. Adding another layer of intrigue to this case is Buddy's own suggestions that perhaps it wasn't an alien craft after all, but, quote, something that Uncle Sam was maybe experimenting with, end quote. This would certainly make sense as to why the military were so adamant about their nonsensical official narrative and why they tried so hard to cover it all up in the end, even though nothing made sense at all about the case. They literally went out of their way to suppress anything and everything, all information having to do with this case in general. Regardless of what happened that night, it was absolutely tragic and definitely still remains an unsolved mystery. Unless you're willing to buy into the government's narrative. I wanted to move on from this case, but I would be remiss in my due diligence if I did so without mentioning some of the things that came to light due to Gord Heath's further investigations into what actually happened here. These are details that point towards this having been some sort of secret mission, and one of those things was the fact that Lieutenant Monkla had quietly left his wallet behind somewhere it would be found, and showing it had been done on purpose before taking off from Kansas Air Force Base. I don't know much about the military, but I found that there's a movie called Destination Tokyo where the servicemen and pilots all left behind their personal belongings and effects before heading out on a secret mission because they knew they wouldn't ever be coming back and wanted to make sure, more than likely anyways, that their families ended up with the only stuff that they had on them once they were gone. Could Monkla have been all too aware of the deadly nature of this particular mission and the fact that he more than likely wouldn't make it out alive? I also came across some testimonies from some rail workers from Canada who were working on the Algoma Central Railway at the time, who told local newspapers that they'd heard the sound of a crash on the night in question. Could it have been the crash of Monkla and Wilson's F-89 fighter jet? What made these claims even more intriguing to me was the fact that several local residents in the area at the time also spoke to reporters, and many of them told the newspapers that they'd witnessed several American fighter jets performing several sweeps, that's quote, sweeps, of that same area for hours after Monkla's jet allegedly initially disappeared. Once again, these statements have to make us wonder if the military knew more than they're letting on, and if perhaps they still do when it comes to this case. Now, I could get into some things that came to light recently, allegedly about this case, but it all comes from the internet and so-called witnesses who most believe more than likely fabricated the information they put forward just to try and be involved in something so huge in this community. This is, after all, a massive unsolved mystery. So, I'm not going to include questionable information from random people on the internet who claim to have insider information. It's all just too far-fetched and somewhat speculative for me, but feel free to look into it on your own if you're interested in doing so. I could not fact-check any of this. Felix Monkla's sister once stated, quote, "We still know nothing about it. I don't think the government wants us to know what happened to them," end quote. Meaning, of course, the United States government and military, and most people familiar with and who have researched into this case absolutely agree with her on that one. And I do too. Let's move on. A few years after the incident we just discussed in March of 1956, another blood-curdling event happened regarding two more military personnel. According to the official report, Sergeant Jonathan Leavitt and Mayor William Cunningham were at the White Sands Missile Testing Grounds near Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico's Tularosa Basin, and they were looking for rocket debris. During their search, Sergeant Leavitt decided to go off on his own to search the edge of a small sand dune somewhat nearby to where his partner was. For just a moment, he disappeared from Mayor Cunningham's sight, and within seconds, Cunningham heard a blood-curdling, terrified scream coming from where he had just seen his friend. Immediately, Cunningham thought that Leavitt had been bitten by a snake or something like that, so he ran over to the edge of the sand dune to help and to see what he could do. But he was greeted with a sight that he couldn't quite wrap his head around. He looked over and saw a large, shiny silver disc hovering over the ground about 20 feet away from where he was standing. There was an opening in the object, and from it, a tentacle-like thing was reaching down out of it. He followed the tentacle from the top where it was coming from the opening in the craft to where it was on the ground and saw that it was wrapped around Lovett's leg. Lovett, during all of this, was screaming in terror as Cunningham helplessly watched on in fear, unable to move or do anything to help his friend. Finally, and within just a few seconds, the thing dragged Lovett towards it and he disappeared completely into the opening of the craft. As soon as he was inside and the opening closed, the disc-shaped shiny silver craft shot into the air and disappeared. It took a few moments for Cunningham to come to his senses, but once he did, he ran back to the military jeep and radioed back to base and told them what had just transpired. He was terrified and still really couldn't believe what had just happened. By the time several military units arrived in response to that distress call, Cunningham was completely in a state of shock. He was taken to a military hospital where he was kept under constant 24-hour supervision and observation. While there in the hospital, he was questioned several times about what had actually transpired between him and Lovett on the day in question, and each and every time he told them the exact same thing he had been telling them from the beginning, which was the exact thing he had told them in the initial distress call he placed immediately after the incident occurred. His official recounting of events, according to the records I found, was that he had seen Lovett dragged aboard a flying saucer by a large tentacle-like appendage, and then the craft had disappeared into the sky very quickly afterward. An interesting fact here, too, is that, at least according to the official report, the radar system at the base had detected an anomalous object in the same region where Lovett had disappeared from at the same time. The anomalous object had simply vanished off the radar into nothingness at the exact same time Cunningham had reported that the craft had taken off and disappeared with Lovett inside of it. Of course, the military sent many search units out into that region, and they all combed over the area for 3 entire days. Eventually, they discovered Lovett's naked corpse approximately 10 miles away from where he had last been seen alive, but being dragged into a spaceship by Cunningham. It was estimated that his body had been left out in the elements anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. This means there were about 24 hours where his body was unaccounted for and his whereabouts were otherwise unknown. His body was eventually returned to base and an autopsy was performed, but it did nothing to help matters and only ended up producing more questions and no more answers. Though his body had been completely and totally mutilated, it had been done so with great care and precision. There were very similar cuts and injuries that we have now come to see in a lot of the cattle mutilation cases. For example, a part of his lower jaw had been precisely cut away and his tongue had been surgically removed from his mouth. His eyes, and also somewhat even more bizarrely, bear with me here, his anus, had also been taken completely out and totally removed. The latter had been described as having been taken out, quote, as if it were a plug or cork stop, end quote. It was determined that whoever, or in this case probably whatever, had inflicted these grotesque injuries most definitely had extremely advanced surgical and medical knowledge, not to mention very precise, well-honed skills. And keep in mind, this is something that we've come to see all the time in the cattle mutilation cases in the following decades, is the fact that he had been completely exsanguinated, meaning every single drop of blood had been drained from his body, and even though the cattle mutilations wouldn't start to become a thing until the early 1960s, if you know about and are familiar with them, then you will know this happens 99% of the time in each and every one of those cases. To add to the mystery of this already very confusing and macabre case was the fact that the autopsy found no sign of vascular collapse. This is important because someone who had bled to death like Lovett was thought to have done would have definitely had a vascular collapse. Somehow, and this is wild, Cunningham's superiors actually accused him of murdering Lovett, but they obviously had no evidence. Where would he have stashed the body during the 48 hours Lovett was still alive, somewhere before he was mutilated? Also, he was under hospital supervision, constant for all 24 hours of the day, and never without someone's eyes on him when the body was found, and he would have had to have moved it from wherever he had been keeping it when he made the initial distress call and put it where it was found, which, as you can already tell, would have been completely and totally impossible. Due to lack of evidence, but not lack of suspicion, he was released without ever being charged with anything in this case. Thank the Lord, because he didn't do it. A report of this incident from Project Grudge, simply titled Report 13, brought another interesting element in this case that I wanted to mention here before we move on. 2 people came forward saying that they had been asked to analyze a document for the United States military, and this is actually the report where most of the public information on this case comes from. The people were 2 men, one named William Cooper, who was only called a researcher, and the other was Captain William English, who was a former Green Beret. Cooper said he had seen an annotated version of the report sometime in the early 1970s, while English said that he had looked into it several years later while he was assigned to the United States Security Service based out of Royal Air Force Base in Chicksands, England. So, both of these men had given their reports separately and independently of one another, and neither had knowledge of the other man or what he had said, or even that anyone else had ever looked into the case at all, and yet both of them recalled identical versions of the events being in the report. Another interesting thing to note here is Report 13 no longer officially exists. And all of the other reports in Project Grudge, so reports 1 through 12 and then 14 and upward, are all available in the public domain. Every single report except for Report 13, which holds the case I just reiterated to you. Now, if that isn't sus, then I don't know what is. Let's move on to yet another horrifying close encounter of the 6th kind. This one happened in October of 1981 in a small town called Panorama in Brazil. At the time the incident takes place, the locals in the area were experiencing and being terrorized by strange objects they called chupas. These chupas had been terrifying the entire region for weeks by the time this incident had happened. The objects in question are most often described as having been oval or circular, with some exceptions saying that they'd been rectangular, and whatever they were would fly quickly through the sky at night, beaming very bright, almost blinding lights onto the ground. The thing is, the lights were almost like an attack on the residents they were being aimed at. On the evening of October 17th, 1981, an attack is exactly what happened. On that night, 2 hunters, Ribamar Ferreira and Abel Boro, were hunting in the woods. They were doing what they'd always done, having fun, minding their own business, when they suddenly noticed a bizarre and glowing object appearing right above where they'd been standing. Later on, Ferreira would describe the object as, quote, looking similar to a luminous tire of a truck, end quote. He said the object was so bright that, quote, it appeared to have turned night into day, end quote. And after a moment or two of just hovering there above them, it slowly started to descend nearer to the men. At this time, it seemed as though the object's attention, as it made its slow descent, was completely and totally focused on Abel Boro. Within moments, Abel was surrounded by some sort of quote-unquote glittering lights that came from the bottom or underside of the object. Ferreira was scared and confused, obviously, and he turned immediately and ran back to the village to try and get some help for his friend, who he thought was in greater danger than he was, as Ribamar could plainly see what was behind those lights, wanted Abel for unknown reasons. He went and told several members of Abel's family what was going on, and he and they ran back to where he had last seen and left his friend. Some time had passed, but not too much, but by the time they got back to that spot in the woods, Abel Boro was dead. There were no wounds or cuts anywhere on his body, but still somehow it would later be determined that he had been completely exsanguinated, not a drop of blood left in his body. His death remains unsolved to this day, and that's really all I could find on this particular encounter, which is also so very odd to me because I feel like something like this should be being talked about, especially here on the internet, and yet it's a story I've never heard of before despite my constant and continual research into encounters just like this one, and I'm sure most of you have never heard of it either. I wanted to move away from the military encounters a little bit because I want you all to know that these types of encounters could happen to anyone and don't just happen to soldiers or pilots, etc. I wanted you guys to know this, not because I wanted to scare you or anything, but because I want you to all always be aware of your surroundings and to be very careful and highly cautious if you ever have the occasion to see and possibly interact with a UFO. I would not take the risk. They would have to either napkid me or telepathically communicate before I'm going anywhere near one. I'm running at the first sight of it. Of course, that's provided I'm not immediately paralyzed or something, which is something they're known to do. While looking into non-military close encounters of the 6th kind, I actually came across far more than I ever expected to, and so I decided to cover a few more here before we end. This is where the video starts getting very long because I was just adamant with myself about covering non-military encounters. So I hope that you guys are still with me. I hope y'all brought a snack. You can pause here, but please don't end the video and come back and watch later. I mean, you definitely can do that if you have to, but it does kind of mess my stuff up. Go grab a snack. Give a pause. I got my Red Bull here, so. Around a decade and a half before the previous encounter happened, another ominous incident occurred in Brazil, and this time it has a name: the lead masks case. It was the summer of 1966 and happened just outside of the city of Rio de Janeiro. The first mention of this case to the wider public was in Jacques Vallée's book called Confrontations. However, I was able to find a more comprehensive and detailed report from just months after the incident actually happened, and I found that in the March 1967 edition of Flying Saucer Review. With the incident bringing so much renewed interest in this case, it's become one of the most widely researched and reinvestigated cases that's ever been put on record. So let's talk about it. On the night of August 17, 1966, at a little after 5 p.m., a local teenager was wandering through the woods in the town of Niteri when he noticed two men sitting straight upright in a nearby clearing. The kid watched the men for several minutes before continuing on his way without saying anything or getting any closer to the strange men. He went about his business and he went home for the night. The following morning, the same kid was wandering through the same exact area as he had been the night before, and once again, he saw the men. They were in the exact same spot as they'd previously been, and they looked like they hadn't moved at all in the time since he'd last been there except to lie down, as they were both now in the same spots but lying completely still and flat on their backs. Once again, he left well enough alone and continued about his business. 2 days later, he was still thinking about the strangeness of it all and was so intrigued about the two men that he decided to go back to the same spot and see if the men would still be sitting there, completely upright and unmoving, or lying flat on their backs and also unmoving as they'd been the last 2 times he'd come across them. Sure enough, he saw the men again, and it shocked him even more so because they looked like they'd not moved a muscle once again, and this time 2 whole days had passed since the last time he'd seen them. This time he decided to take a closer look, and as he walked closer and closer to the two men, he noticed a horrific smell suddenly invading his senses as he got nearer to them. He knew instinctively that the men were dead just based on the smell alone, but also because he had now put 2 and 2 together as to why they were still there and why they'd not moved at all in that time. Be that as it may, he continued on towards them, and eventually he was close enough to be able to see them clearly. Both men were wearing very nice, seemingly brand new suits, and both of them had raincoats over the top of the suits. The raincoats also appeared to be brand new. Even stranger still was the fact that both of the men had crudely made lead masks over their faces. The man had had enough, and he turned back and ran to his village to get some help and tell about what he'd just witnessed. He informed the authorities, and though they headed out right away, it would take most of the day for the police to be able to navigate through the rough and tough terrain of those woods. When they finally arrived at the scene and saw the two men, they were just as shocked and confused as the young teenager had been. Multiple investigations, both by the official authorities and also by private investigators, ensued throughout the following weeks, but no one could really understand or make any sense of what they'd come to know had happened. What had caused these men to have died in the first place, and why were they out there in such an odd way in the first place? What was with the lead masks over their faces? Was it some sort of bizarre experiment gone wrong, a strange ritual gone awry, or was it outright murder? No one knew, but the men were eventually identified. One of the men was identified as 43-year-old Jose Viana, and the other was 32-year-old Manuel Pereira de Cruz, and both of them were local electricians from a nearby small village called Atafona. The authorities spoke to the locals in the community, and they found that both of the men were well-liked, respected, and no one knew them to have any obvious enemies at all. Once the grim details of the case were released to the public, information started to come in to the police. Let's talk about some of the initial findings first, which left the police very unnerved and confused, and that's to say the least. First of all, the woods where the men were found were known for being very serene, and the investigators also noticed that the area around them was completely undisturbed. There had been no signs at all of any struggles having taken place, and honestly, that was even more obvious by the fact that both men were neatly dressed, and not even a single hair from either of their heads seemed to have been out of place. It was almost as though the men had merely laid down next to one another and just randomly died within seconds of one another, or at the exact same time. Initial autopsies didn't help, and in fact made things even more confusing. It seemed to the coroner that both men had died of sudden, massive heart attacks, with their deaths indeed happening mere seconds from one another, or at the very same time. As we now know, and as they did back then as well, though, something had to have caused the heart attacks in the first place. And from what the teenager had initially told the police, they figured that something had to have happened between the first time he'd seen them and they were sitting straight upright and unmoving on the night of August 17th at around 5 p.m. and when he went back and saw that they were lying flat on their backs side by side at around 9 the following morning on August 18th. As the authorities questioned members of the local community, they would come to find several witnesses who said they'd seen a strange glowing orange object that seemed to have been hovering directly over the clearing where the men had been discovered on the evening of the 17th. Some witnesses even reported that several orange beams of light had shot down from the object towards the ground in that same area. One of the most interesting parts of this case, at least in my opinion, appeared in the Brazilian national newspaper. The witness this time was a woman called Senhora Gracinda Contijo de Sousa, and she said that she had seen, quote, an unusual object, end quote, hovering directly over Vintum Hill on the night in question. This also happens to be where the two bodies were discovered, Vintum Hill. People who knew this woman said she was very credible and not known at all for making up stories or being a liar. The newspaper reported that, quote, she was driving along with 3 of her children when they saw an orangey color with a band of fire around its edges. The object was sending out rays in all directions and was hanging over the top of the hill. She stopped her car, and with her children she watched the object as it rose and fell vertically for some 3 to 4 minutes, end quote. Following the initial reports that came in about strange objects hovering overhead, were further reports that came in from the public in the area, which eventually ended up attracting the attention of many UFO investigators. It would soon come to light that there had been another UFO incident several weeks earlier, so let's talk about that now. I know this is getting long. I know this is going to be a long video, guys, but bear with me because this other incident has everything to do with what happened to these 2 men. To keep it simple, though, I'm going to let MU explain a little bit of what happened. Quote, according to an article in Flying Saucer Review, on the evening of June 13th, a quote-unquote violent explosion occurred in the 2 dead men's village. According to the report, the publication had received regular reports of UFO sightings in the days leading up to the explosion. However, rather suspiciously, the Brazilian newspaper suddenly stopped reporting on the sightings due to the authorities wrapping a, quote, cloak of security, end quote, around the encounters. This was followed by rumors of some kind of bizarre electrical experiment taking place on the beach involving several local residents, as well as the discovery of some kind of electrical device stored in a nearby garden. Even stranger, several local residents reported seeing a quote-unquote ball of fire crossing the sky on the evening in question, as well as fishermen reported seeing a, quote, flying saucer, end quote, crashing into the sea, end quote. The 2 men who were present during the incident in June of 1966 were our victims in this case, Viana and Cruz. I want to talk about the timeline of events that the authorities managed to piece together, which somehow led to the deaths of our victims in the forest. At sometime around 9 in the morning on August 17th, Viana and Cruz left their village to travel to Sao Paulo, where they planned on purchasing a car as well as some electrical equipment that they needed for work. Though there's been no evidence ever found that shows they actually bought the car or even the equipment, neither of the men had much money on them when they were found in the woods. Robbery was ruled out as a possible motive, though, because neither man had any bruises or injuries anywhere on their bodies at the time of the discovery. Plus, as I said, their suits, their hair, their bodies in general were in pristine condition. Ultimately, after they boarded a bus, which was around 2 that afternoon, the 2 of them each bought a raincoat, which were the ones they were wearing over their suits when they were found. Now, according to the weather on this date at this time in this area, that kind of makes sense. That absolutely makes sense, actually, because it was raining. According to the receipts found on the men, after purchasing the raincoats, they went to a local bar and each purchased a bottle of mineral water. The fact that they kept the receipts told investigators that they were intending to claim the money for the empty bottles on their return journey. So this means they had no plans of unaliving themselves at all. It was sometime around 3 in the afternoon when they set off into the woods where they'd eventually be found. At 5 p.m. that same night is when the original witness, the teenager, first spotted them out there sitting upright in the clearing and unmoving. However, what happened between that time and 9 the next morning when that same teen saw them lying on their backs is anyone's guess. Several pieces of paper were discovered and they seemingly had strange instructions on them. For example, one of the notes read, quote, Sunday, 1 pill after meal, Monday, 1 pill after breakfast, Tuesday, 1 pill after meal, Wednesday, 1 pill lying down, end quote. Another note said, quote, 4:30 p.m., be at appointed place, 6:30 p.m., swallow pill, then protect face with metal and await for signal to show itself, end quote. Upon further examination of these same notes, it was crazily and somehow determined that neither of the two men had written the notes themselves. They were apparently instructions for some kind of countdown, but again, without any further explanation, we've got nothing more to gain from them, despite how intriguing they are to this case. MU goes on to say, quote, one line of thought was that the two men were looking to purchase unorthodox materials, possibly illegal ones, which might explain why they were meeting someone in an out-of-the-way place and why they had taken so much money with them, yet appeared to not have purchased anything. Had they been double-crossed somehow? And just what were they trying to purchase, if anything? Could it even be possible that the two men were somehow involved in some sort of espionage? And just how did the UFO sightings fit into all of this? If we recall that one witness claimed to have seen beams of light directed toward where the two men were found, could this have been what caused their sudden cardiac arrests? Or, returning to the speculative links to the intelligence agencies, could their deaths have been made to look like heart attacks and the UFO sightings have been purely coincidental? End quote. I mean, that's a lot to unpack. I want you guys to let me know what you think in the comments. This, to me, is obviously two men who were out in the middle of nowhere trying to make contact with extraterrestrial beings and probably got what they were looking for, but while they got it, they got a whole lot more than they bargained for in the process. Not all extraterrestrials are higher vibrational and all about peace and love and spirit. In fact, as we've discussed here today, and as most of us should already know, had we been paying attention to everything we've discussed here on this channel at all, and that I've been saying for years, there are so many unknown species out there that we know nothing about, including their intentions when it comes to our planet and human beings in general. Also, a lot of the encounters we cover are with what we would call evil beings who want nothing more than to harm or possibly kill us. There are also the soul eaters who can't kill us because then they'd have no food, but who wouldn't mind seeing us on the brink of death. The fact is, you simply can't trust any entity from beyond any veil on this planet. Anything and everything that comes here does so for a reason. And sometimes people just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and become victims of circumstance and bad luck. All of these encounters stood out to me, but the one that made the most impact was definitely the last one, because those men had actually been planning on making contact, but more than likely didn't know that there's more than one type of creature out there. And more than likely, in my opinion, they'd given someone money for the interactions or the instructions on how to contact the entities in question. Knowing what we know, I think it's safe to assume that it's more than possible whoever gave these men that information had set them up to be sacrifices to whatever beings they were in league with. That's a terrifying thought, almost like someone setting you up to sell your soul to the devil or become someone's ritual sacrifice in exchange for hidden knowledge, money, great power, etc. Call me crazy if you want to, but you will never call me dead by extraterrestrial. You won't find me out in any woods looking to make any contact without first knowing what I'm doing. And with that being said, I have learned to do that properly and have even been planning a live streaming event when I call them in so that everyone watching can see it. However, it hasn't been the right time yet, so I'll keep you posted on when that will be. Anyways, join me next week for when we talk about paranormal Bigfoot encounters. And until then, that's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me. Spread the love by sharing this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, all right? That really just makes such a huge difference. It means so much to me. Leave at least 7 characters in the comments. Again, share this. Make sure your notification bell... I've been talking for so long. Make sure your notification bell is turned on and switched to all so you get notified every single time I post any sort of content. Support my YouTube shorts. If you're on TikTok, check me out, GemmaJadeYT. Facebook is simply GemmaJade, my name. And if you're on X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, I recently just got it. I don't have a lot going on in there yet, but I do plan on implementing it. It is GemmaJadeYT. Yes, I have an Instagram, GemmaJadeYT, but I don't know how to use all this social media, guys, so I mainly do YouTube, and then second to that is TikTok, and I'm trying to incorporate these other social media platforms into what I'm doing. So be patient with me and just support me any way that you can. Information in the description box, ways to donate to the channel, my PayPal, Cash App, my Amazon wish list gift link. My birthday is March 1st. A lot of y'all, just like you do every year, have reached out asking what I want for my birthday. I want donations, but if you want to just send me something, send me a gift. My Amazon wish list gift link is right in the description box, and there's nothing on there that I don't want. I put everything on there, so anything you send through that list, so appreciated, and I'd be so grateful for. There's also links in the description box for all of my books on Amazon. If you can't find a link you're looking for, because I have Kindle, paperback, and Audible for most of the books, I thought I had them all, but I think some are missing. Just go to Amazon and type in Gemma Jade Books. My whole collection will come up. Gone Mysterious Disappearances Volume 5, I'm hoping to have out the first week of March, but maybe even before my birthday, because I'm doing really well on that. I found some doozies of bizarre and strange unexplained disappearances for this one. I mean, all of my books, all 4 before this one were really good, but this one is like, how did I miss these cases to even begin with? Please consider emailing me, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com, for autographed copies of my book to send in your own listener encounters with the strange, the bizarre, paranormal, supernatural, otherworldly, extraterrestrial, etc. For any and all correspondence, including orders, if you want to know about my manifestation intention sprays, which are homemade, my spiritual helper boxes, my subscription spiritual boxes that come once a month. For any and all correspondence, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today, you're amazing. You got this. Just keep claiming nothing but the best, nothing but blessings for yourself. I believe in you. I got your back. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger. And I will see you guys next time. I am out of here. Bye.